Well, greetings, everyone. My name is Peter Young. I'm a member of the Committee 100, and I happen to be the head of this Asian American Career Ceilings initiative that is now in its fifth year, and we've got about 60 events. And I'm very, very pleased to have our two panelists, both of whom happen to be Committee 100 members, but that's not a criteria for being a speaker on this program. But before we start, I just want to say two things. One is this whole series program got started because, quite honestly, Asian Americans, they have no trouble getting entry jobs in many, many professions. But when they hit the middle ranks, it just seems like they hit a barrier. And some people use the phrase bamboo ceiling, so forth, but it is just a reality. So with a few exceptions, such as Indian Americans in technology, it's really very, very difficult to see proportionate Asian Americans in very senior ranks in many different industries. So we have a series of experts talk about what the data says, people in different industries talking about what's different about the problem, people who talk about what the solutions are, and so forth. So it's really been very helpful for people to both identify where the problem is, but also learn about ways that they can combat the career ceilings problem. Last, before I start this program, is two upcoming events. One is August 5th, and that will be a very interesting panel on the impact of AI on Asian American careers in technology. It's a hot topic. It's a hot topic, period, regardless of whether you're talking about Asian Americans or not. But we have two very good panelists, Buck G and Deb Liu. And then on August 26th, we will have our next edition of a series of advice and networking events going through different industries. And this one will be on technology. And it's somewhat unique. And what we basically do is we have advisors who are experienced people in the industry, and we pair them up virtually in a virtual space where you can go and talk to them, network, get advice, etc. And we've done ones on investing, we've done on industrial companies, etc., legal, and they've been very successful because we're trying to create an opportunity for people to get advice, to meet each other, because that's part of the solution to the problem. With regard to today's event, which is titled Creating Organizational Change from Within, the rationale for this was very simple, and that is when we did a survey of Asian Americans in December, and we asked them, one of the questions was, what are the reasons why you think there are obstacles for Asian Americans? Well, the top three was organizational structure and behavior, how the companies are structured, how they make promotions, how they identify leaders, etc. So that's why this one, I think, is a very important topic. We have two wonderful panelists, Eric Chang, who's a Chief Business and Strategy Officer at Gap, who has not only been in that clothing retail industry, but he's been in a number of other industries. So he can speak from his knowledge and experience with corporations. And Joyce Chang, who is the chair of global research for JP Morgan, very important job there and an important institution. And she can talk not only about her own observations at her company and other financial institutions, but a lot of the things that she has pioneered within JP Morgan to try to make, to create an even playing field. I guess that's the right word, not an advantage, just a level playing field. So with that, I won't read their bios because I know that all of you in the audience can read and you read the invitation. But what I'd like to do is maybe ask each of the panelists really just to take a few minutes and briefly tell the audience about your background and career. And I'm just going to arbitrarily go by by alphabetical order, which Eric, because you're a missing G at the bottom of your name, you go first, right? Go ahead.
Well, look, I appreciate the opportunity to speak, Peter, and great to hear from you again, Joyce. So my career, just in a nutshell, is sort of a unique one of sorts, I guess. I've done and been in a lot of different industries, which I guess whether you want to talk about tech industries, the service industry, banking or consulting, or sort of call it large consumer product corporate, sort of played in a few different dimensions. But the last 20 years has been mostly around the consumer segment. I guess sort of the claim to fame to some degree was CFO at the LA Clippers, obviously an NBA sports team, of which there are very, very few Asians sort of in higher ranks, unless you're an owner. And sort of the opportunity to work in sort of that field and thrive within that sort of field sort of was, again, something that I'm very, very proud to sort of represent. And now here today, in the last 3 years, I've been at Gap Inc., which is obviously the big fashion retailer. And again, in a very, very similar way, very, very few sort of Asians, especially Chinese Americans, that are in the fashion industry from a corporate perspective.
Yeah.
And so, certainly would love to dialogue today about sort of my experience in sort of getting to these sort of roles, trying to navigate and find ways to sort of break through, but also find opportunities to really support fellow Asian Americans as they sort of navigate their careers in a similar way. So again, appreciate the time.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, a couple of you raised your hands electronically. I just want to mention to you that we are going to leave some time at the end for Q&A. And the way we do it is just type in your question to the Q&A chat box. And both Joyce and Eric and I, all of us will be able to see your questions, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. Joyce, your background?
Yeah, no, well, thank you. It's so great to be with Eric and Peter, with you and everybody in the audience. So I have been at JP Morgan for 27 years, but a career Wall Street researcher for 37 years. But I ended up on Wall Street by complete accident. When I started working back in 1989, my specialty was emerging markets, but it wasn't called emerging markets back then. It was called less developed country, third world. It's gone back to being called the global South. And there were no private sector jobs. If you were doing that, you were going to the IMF or the World Bank or the Foreign Service. And that was where I thought my path would be. But I got a call one day, in the career service offices there at Princeton, where I was doing my graduate degree. And they said, look, who is the best person you have who does third world stuff? And they were like, well, the best person, actually the only person, because it wasn't a terribly popular field to study, is Joyce. So Solomon Brothers, where Peter also had worked, was getting its corporate bond mortgage desk was getting these offers to bid on defaulted emerging markets debt that were bank loans that were being written off the balance sheet. Basically Solomon was like, you could put in a bid for this. And they're like, well, we don't know anything. We're corporate bond traders. So nobody thought this was an asset class. This is when China's GDP was $600 a year. Hyperinflation in Latin America was over 10,000%. So they're like, well, let's just call a graduate school and see if we can get some student who knows something about third world stuff. So that's how I started at Solomon Brothers, and I had never worked in the private sector. I really thought I'd be in the foreign service, but I loved markets. I loved the immediacy of it. I loved that there wasn't a right or a wrong answer, that the markets were, you could have a point of view and it would play out. The way my career developed was, a lot of the world has changed a lot, but back then, your typical global financial crisis was pretty similar. It started with a banking crisis that became a sovereign crisis that required a bailout, and then a moral hazard problem, a public opinion problem, a Congress that you had to get things through. So I had the most experience with bailouts when the US financial crisis came around. I ended up getting the US portfolio. And then when the Eurozone crisis came out, I ended up getting the European portfolio until I ran all of research. And what I do now is much more thematic research. I don't do market calls anymore in year 37. I do a lot of thematic research, and a lot of it's on the geopolitics, on US-China relations, on what's happening with supply chains, on the way the world order has changed. I've also am the executive sponsor at JP Morgan for our Asian Employee Network, which is called Aspire, which is Asians reaching for excellence, something like that. We have 40,000 members. I grew up in a pretty small town in Iowa, so when I got to college at Columbia, I joined every Asian American thing that I could. I grew up sort of, in a town that didn't have another Asian family. So I've always been involved with this. And I feel like at JP Morgan, there's been a real commitment to, putting in some, actionable ideas and practical programs.
Oh, wonderful. Well, we should trade stories about what it was like to being at Solomon Brothers one day, but it's really interesting because actually when I first went to college, it was trying to get in at all. Remember, I went to an Ivy League school and they admitted exactly 15 Asian Americans, regardless of citizenship, every year for 10 years. And finally we said, we think you have a quota, right? Because 15 out of 1,200 seems like a bad number, right? And they finally loosened it up, but now it's evolved from just getting in and now trying to get, proceed and get up. So let me tell you, let's start with the big picture, which is, what do you think the state of this career ceilings issue is for Asian Americans today? Where do you think the barriers are, the different types of barriers? Because it's not just one type, right? And it may be different by industry. I don't know, but I'd be interested in your opinions about what you think the things that are barriers today for Asian Americans in industry and finance. And either one of you can say whatever you wish.
Maybe I'll start off and then Joyce, feel free to sort of add on. So I think this sort of notion of the bamboo ceiling or the glass ceiling is very sort of near and dear to my heart. I've actually spoken about this a few times, but one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this topic is that my dad was sort of subject to this, during his career. And it was sort of a very emotional moment, sort of watching him sort of go through it and being sort of passed over a number of different times for what he believed to be sort of, biased decisions. And so as I sort of now compare sort of, maybe his time period when I was, more a high school kid to now sort of here today, 30 years later, I think in many ways, things have gotten a little bit better because of some sort of macro dynamics. One, there are more sort of Asian Americans in CEO positions and more Asian Americans in executive positions. And so by default of that, you have sort of more people just accustomed to leadership coming from the Asian American demographic, which again helps. But I do still feel like there's definitely a lot more work that Asians sort of have to do to get to senior level positions and to maintain senior level positions. I think some of those barriers, include expectations. So I think that one of the big things as you sort of rise through the ranks in any company, and I sort of say this at all times, is that we are all salespeople of some kind. And you could be selling internally, you could be selling externally, you could really be a salesperson, but you're always selling something. And the ability to actually get work done, to get consensus, to build momentum around projects, all requires a level of communication, both verbally and through words. And I do think that there's sort of a bias that Asians have some level of a limitation in terms of whether it be the language itself or their ability to be for them to have strong conviction about using the language to convince others, because there's always a perception that Asians may be a little more shy, they may be a little bit more reserved, they may be a little bit more analytical, and so you get boxed in. And I think one of the biggest sort of lessons that I would sort of say that I have seen over my, last 30 years of working has sort of been around this notion of I constantly, even today, feel like I'm always boxed in a little way. People believe that I may be the smartest guy in the room, but that boxes me in as to sort of what I can and can't do. And so part of this is really feeling like that will always sort of exist to a certain degree. And now the question is, how do you sort of break through that and show that you can be a leader, show that you can be a rainmaker, show that you can be someone who can bring a consensus and bring teams together, someone that can be the spokesperson for a company or an organization. All those things that eventually people utilize as criteria of whether or not this person can be a senior executive at my company or can continue to rise, those things exist. And now the question is sort of, how do you sort of break through, which we can speak about, in a moment.
Yeah, Joyce, any comments? Again, organizational barriers that you perceive?
Yeah, no, I think that, Eric really pointed out many of the things that I have seen over my career is that it's like a pyramid. At the bottom, there's a lot of Asians, and as you get towards the top, there's many fewer. And I do think that is because many people see Asians as being very good at staff roles, but not necessarily the ones who are going to advance to senior roles. So you talked about organizational versus behavioral barriers. And I felt that a lot of it was behavioral. So some of the things that we have done to address this is like we developed something that was called VP Vice President Academy. And basically the idea was to identify top Asian talent at the vice president level, to increase their visibility and to prep vice presidents to get key assignment roles going forward. And the things that I ended up working on that I think made the most impact, there were two different things. Well, one was definitely about the presentation skills. And I remember I was at one point on this, something they called the Asian Task Force, but it was, why are there so few Asian American women who are managing directors? And there's a whole promotion process at JP Morgan, much like other banks, where there's an independent review and you kind of make the case. And I remember, because I'm a researcher, I was like, oh, send the form over to Joyce. And I remember circling it, and they were like, well, this woman hasn't gotten through twice now, so this is the third time.
Right.
And it was like a 2-page form, and I circled on it in 2 pages 4 different times. Like, it was like, this person is great, they just need to work on their presence. This person, has such great skills. If their presence were just a little bit stronger, but it's a 2-page form. So I first circled presence 4 times, and I called up the manager and I said, "Look, you're really well intentioned, but you're part of the problem. What does it mean to be at the pinnacle of your career and to write on somebody's form they don't have presence, they don't have a personality, they don't have." I'm not sure what that means.
Yeah, right.
So the whole point of the VP Academy was that, we made people do presentations. I said, like, pretend like you're going to the trading meeting, give me a 3-minute pitch right now, and we're going to tape it and play it back to you. And I remember saying to a lot of women, if I have to tell you to physically speak up, then, there's a big problem here.
Right.
And if I, and if people just can't even physically hear you. And so a lot of people said, look, that was just very valuable. And I said, look, I'm not telling you this is going to be comfortable. And I tell a lot of women, you speak up twice so people don't think it's a fluke the first time.
Yeah.
And you stop saying, I think, I know you think.
Right.
You need to be more declarative in this. And even when we do like AI training, I say, look at the way that some of the female responses you get compared to the way men are inputting things into AI. So the presentation skills were a big part of it. The other thing we did, which was, I think, really important, was role playing. And it was like, okay, let's just say you screwed something up. Like, I reported something wrong as a researcher, or you misbooked a ticket if you're a salesperson, or you misbooked a trade if you're a trader. So we would role play. How do you talk through that situation with the person you made a mistake with? Right. And so instead of apologizing but not fixing it, or being more declarative or coming up with a solution. So I thought there were some really practical things that you could do to try to, first of all, identify people for our pipeline early in their career at the VP level. And then you'll also provide them with skills and feedback that would be helpful for them to make them more effective leaders in an organization.
Yeah, no, you point out some really good points, and what's interesting is not enough companies try to find ways to help people who truly are talented achieve an even playing field. And I'm glad to hear that you have like this VP program and so forth, because some people, there's a limit to how much you can do just by yourself, right? You need some help, and it could either be from people who are your friends or colleagues, but also organizationally, right? And it sounds like at JP Morgan, you have things so that the organization can help people at least succeed within their level of expertise, right?
Yeah, I think that, that network, and I think Eric put it very well, is, really important that you sort of, you need to show you have the leaders who can bring teams together, who can build consensus, who can, really take on something broader than a staff role. So it's identifying that talent, trying to develop a pipeline, and then also trying to make sure that there are skills, and also people who will advocate for others, like if you're in a managing director committee. And I think it's very important to point out that you need different things at different points in your career. So MD promotion is very different than when you first become a vice president and you're really working on, like as Eric put it, you got to be a salesperson, you got to develop your brand. But then your leadership, and whether people see you as senior leadership material that will get the stretch job, is then different from that, different from your brand. So the things that you work on need to evolve depending on what stage in your career you're at.
Yeah, that's right. What's interesting, I'll cite this survey again, which is available to anyone who wants to get a copy. There were two things that were kind of interesting that dovetail with what you're saying. One was top 3 reasons why they felt that the reasons why they weren't successful. One was the lack of mentors and networking, and the second one was own behavior. So it's both sides. In other words, that they weren't doing the things that they needed to do to succeed, like Eric was saying, being assertive and being a salesman. But the other was that there was a lack of networking, a structure, and mentoring to help them succeed and get good advice. So it's both. It's really both sides. Now I have a question for both of you, because Eric, you've been in a number of different industries, and I think it's safe to say that basketball is different from Gap business. Is that a fair statement, right?
It's fair. It's fair. Yeah.
Yeah. There's no manufacturing, say, making basketball players, right? And Joyce, although you've been in investment banking finance, the reality is you've had to look at all sorts of different companies and how they were run. So do you see, either one of you, it's up to you whether you want to say anything, do you see any differences in the barriers and obstacles, either by industry or the size of the company or structure, right? Industry is pretty straightforward, size is pretty straightforward. Structure could be partnerships versus, corporations versus whatever, right? Or nonprofits. Any differences that you see? And I'll start with you, Eric, because you've had you've been in how many industries that are really different, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. It's a great question. I would say that what I personally have found is that some of the challenges that we're sort of talking about maybe are a little bit more prevalent in larger size companies based on my experience. I think when you're in smaller size companies, again, you just don't have the resources, you don't have enough people. It's a little bit, maybe hopefully a little bit more entrepreneurial in nature, and people are just, sometimes I would just sort of say, get past some of these things. And now it's just all about like, we're all in the same boat rowing together, and race, gender, age, any of that stuff doesn't matter. As long as you can provide value to the team, we're going to just keep on going. And so, and as long as you can keep on producing, there's sort of layers that sort of go up, but that's sort of in a smaller sort of, company setup. Now, that all being said, I think in spirit, this issue of Asian discrimination, call it at large, exists across the board. Doesn't even matter if it's small, big, if it's in entertainment, if it's in consumer products, if it's in finance. It exists. It's just to sort of what degree and so forth. I will say that in industries, it's different, right? So in sports, again, in general, there are very few Asians in sports management. And so there, frankly, I know sort of the people in football or baseball that are in sort of similar like positions, and it's a number that you can probably count on sort of one or two hands. And so we sort of as leaders sort of find opportunities sort of band together and share common stories and support each other and so forth. So I think all those things are definitely places where in sports, the first issue is, do Asians want to get into sports at an earlier stage of their career and sort of be working through the ranks? You find that most Asians don't, partly because maybe their parents don't like it as a sort of a career option for them. Maybe it's not making enough money earlier in their career, and they'd rather go pursue an opportunity in AI or some finance or some other place. But sports is one of those kind of career tracks where you really start from the bottom and you have to sort of work your way up. And I find that the entry point for Asians are a lot less. And so what you do see is people transitioning into sports at a mid-level and sort of getting stuck at the mid-level. And that's sort of where some of those sort of challenges lie.
For sports, you made it sports. What you say there are very few Asian Americans at senior levels. Is it because they're not pursuing that career, or is it because they can't get up through the organization? Or
it's a mixture of all, right? So I think that in sports there are some unique dynamics that there are a lot of people who basically are lifers in sports that have worked their way up from being the person doing concessions or mopping up the floor to eventually someday becoming president of the organization. But that may take 30 years to sort of get so, and working through a whole bunch of different jobs. And in general, you don't sort of find a lot of Asians willing to sort of take that sort of long view on their career and saying, you know what, I'm going to work as an apprentice all the way up, and I don't care what job I take because this is sort of where I want to be. Where you find people coming into sports from an Asian descent is sort of that mid-level, call it manager, director level, specific to do a job. They're a manager they're a controller, they're a director of marketing, and they come from a different career track, but they sort of tap out because navigating sports also is a little bit tricky. It's a very male-dominated sort of industry, so that's sort of one layer, and it's also a very, call it Caucasian sort of a dominated industry based on whether you were an athlete in the past or people or whatever. That's how sort of things are sort of brought up, and so then the question then is, how do you navigate it? I was sort of in a very unique and fortunate place where I had an opportunity to enter at a C level with no prior sports experience, no prior sort of athletic experience, mind you. I didn't play any college sports, and so the opportunity to do so was purely on merit. And so again, my situation is a little bit unique there, but sort of watching how other Asians sort of dealt with it in sports, sort of my feedback is sort of around some of those unique dynamics that make it a little bit tricky to kind of get from point A to point B.
Joyce, maybe you can comment that. And actually, what's interesting is not only you see lots of industries, but to be honest with you, within investment banking, it's actually a collection of very different fields, right? There's no question that someone in trading just has a very different career than somebody who's in M&A or corporate finance. So whatever perspective you like, maybe if you can comment on the differences that you see.
Well, when I was first starting out, my specialty was emerging markets, like looking at a sovereign financial balance sheet and what causes sovereign crises. But what I remember most clearly when I started was, I would go to meet with central bank governors and ministers of finance, and just the look of complete dismay. Solomon Brothers has sent a Chinese girl in her 20s to ask me to open up all of my balance sheet and it's going to write about it and say, oh, it's overweight, underweight, or neutral. And then it was like also hard because you had to explain what Asian American was. Like they didn't understand, like, what are you anyway? So I realized a number of things. First of all, I think, Peter, you worked at Solomon Brothers as well. Solomon Brothers wasn't like any other bank. You just had to be so aggressive to survive there. And they really didn't care if you were male, female, purple, or anything else. Like you just had to be aggressive and make money. So, you know, and it was a great place to start because if I had started at a more typical place, it would have been much harder, I think, than that. But I realized really quickly I had to turn something that could be a disadvantage into an advantage. And I realized that everybody would look at me because I was the only woman in the room or the only Asian in the room. So if I said something that was average, I would be considered stupider than average. But if I said something that was smarter, not brilliant, I'd also be remembered as smarter. So you have to be really prepared. But the key thing is you have to speak up.
Right, right.
And I think that's the hardest thing for Asians. And, you know, when you think about it from a banking point of view, like, you know, so JP Morgan Chase is the product of, I forget the number, something like 1,200 mergers. But the JP Morgan Chase merger was one of those mergers where it's like a truck came to run you over, that it backed up to come to run you over again. It was like everybody was a co-head. And I remember one meeting where I was in a meeting with my key nemesis. And you know, and everybody has these meetings where everything goes wrong. People speak over you, or they give somebody else credit for something you just said, or you can't break into the conversation. So I had this meeting where everything went wrong. And I run into my key nemesis later that day, hands in his pockets, whistling away. And he's like, hey, Changer, you know,
Yeah,
Changer, you know, good meeting, huh? Tough, but good. And I realized it was just a game to him.
yeah.
Right. So I think part of it was, you know, but you can't take it personally. You have to turn something that could be a competitive disadvantage into an advantage. You need to take the risk because for so many Asians, speaking up is really just not that comfortable or natural. And I remember I was doing something with Ida Lu for Asian Heritage Month, and we were going through the best and the worst advice you've ever received. And Ida was like, you work hard and it will pay off. That's the worst advice I've ever seen.
Absolutely. Terrible. Terrible.
So, you know, I think you have to be more strategic and you have to also, you know, help each other out. Like you can be in a room and you can amplify somebody else. You can say, well, I agree with that point, or so-and-so didn't, you know, just said that. Like you begin to find ways that you can advocate for others. And, you know, if you went through it yourself, because I think this happens to a lot of women and a lot of Asians.
Yeah. By the way, here, actually, what you say makes me think about, actually, both of you say makes me think about this one question, which is, you know, I mentor a lot of people and I give a lot of advice. And it's interesting when I talk to them about, you know, what criteria are you using to decide which company or what industry? They focus on, well, I'm good at this or good at that, whatever. It is rare that they say, I looked at the company and looked at their structure and how much politics and whether they had a bias against Asians. They rarely say that, which is really sad because the reality is it should be one. It should be one of the factors that you think about because you could be equally talented and go into one place which is very political and very Caucasian oriented, or another one, and it'll make a huge difference in your career. By the way, the Solomon thing, I remember when I was deciding whether to join Solomon Brothers or Lazard, and one friend of mine said, well, you're a somewhat genteel person. Good luck at Solomon Brothers because it's arm-to-arm combat. He said, you probably would be better off at Lazard. I ended up going to Solomon Brothers, but the favorite saying was, the difference between Solomon Brothers and Morgan Stanley is if Morgan Stanley, they stab you in the back, and Solomon Brothers, they stab you in the front, but they start running towards you with the knife from the end of the hallway. But I said, look, it's going to be a learning experience, but I went in knowing that was, you know, that. Now, do you feel that that's the case? I mean, that do you think people should try to assess the difference either by industry, like as you said, Eric, sports is a male dominated, right? Or by a type of, of culture, right? Because there are big differences in culture, right?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say to that specific question is absolutely, as you're sort of thinking about joining any company, and you hear these stories almost like after the fact or postmortems a year or two into their job. I wish I made a slightly different decision if I asked these questions earlier. But I think part of it is that if you're sort of in that mid to upper level, trying to sort of work to sort of get into that C level, or if you're already in that C level, I think part of it is just assessing sort of who the top people are. And these are the people that are running the company. They're setting the tone. They're the pace setters for the organization. How do they work? How do they act? And you can sort of get a feel. Sometimes it's an old boys network kind of group there. Sometimes, it's a very quiet, everyone sort of, silent group. I think everyone has their own sort of style. And I think what a lot of people do when they sort of get into new opportunities is they sort of evaluate the company, the compensation, and the many other sort of, their job role and responsibility. And those are all very, very important. But ultimately, their path to sort of growth and success and to sort of hit some of their ambition is going to be constrained by who's running that organization. And do you feel like you can be successful with them being hopefully advocates for you? Or what do you think that you can do to ensure that you're going to be thought of highly? And is this sort of the group of people that you can sort of do, good work with and for? And so I think absolutely, I think that question is something that should definitely be more consideration. And I find more and more C levels wishing that they asked a little more diligence in terms of how the C level team worked together, what the interaction points were, what the culture was like. They sometimes don't ask and sort of assume that it's like every other company. And the reality is that every company has its own sort of unique dynamics, good or bad.
Yeah. And I would certainly encourage everyone in the audience that when you think about career moves or where you are, ask yourself not only the questions like Eric's saying, which is this a good company? Are they a good competitive position, so forth? But also their organizational structure, they're very political and so forth. But then ask the question about yourself. Do I hate politics? In which case, maybe I shouldn't join a company where it's very political, or am I too soft spoken? So do some self-assessment as well. Joyce, your view on this?
So I'm often asked, like, what do you think about formal sponsorship and mentorship programs? And I haven't been a huge fan of those very formal programs. I think it's very important, as Eric says, like, you've got to develop these meaningful relationships. That's very key. But like, getting assigned something formally is usually not the way that you end up doing that. So it takes time, and it takes time. And what you have to tell people sometimes is that you have to be mentorable. So it's also investing the time to work and to yield benefits to both parties. So I said, look, if somebody just comes up and says, I want you to be my mentor, that's not the way to approach it. You need to look at sort of who is around you, who can help you build something, and you can also help them and develop that relationship. And that also takes time. So I often will be asked the question, what about a formal mentorship program? The way we do it here is people sign up voluntarily if they want to mentor somebody, or there are different things. Like, there's one group that's called Candid Conversation. So if you just kind of want a safe space where MDs volunteer to run something for more junior people, and particularly during the pandemic, during Stop AAP I Hate, this was really important. So I don't know if it's just so much the formal networks, but I think it's very much, as Eric said, you need to sort of observe the way that people make decisions, collaborate, and how you can make a difference in a way where people will see what your potential is, not just that you have, a certain set of credentials. So I think that no matter what the company or the industry, I would just say that those are things that are more behavioral, in my opinion, than necessarily saying, how is this industry organized, or do I have a formal mentor?
Yeah, and you have a good point about mentorship. There are some people who love to be mentors. Some people have just no interest, right? And you have to figure
You get
that
to,
out.
yeah,
Yeah, you have to figure it out because you could ask all day long of someone who just has no desire to be a mentor and you're not going to get anywhere, right?
Yeah.
You know, so you got to find those people who feel that they have an interest. And then you have to say, why me, right? Why me, right?
Yeah.
I have another question for the two of you. You know, the topic here is creating organizational change from within. And clearly, the tools available to you, if you're more junior versus more senior, are very, very different. You know, if you're a junior person, well, you know, the tools are limited and also their risk, right? If I stick my head, I push something, maybe I piss someone off, right? Who says, wait, what's this person? So could you talk a little bit about, for those people who are in the middle ranks, and they care about their success, but also they care about the general principle, which is to help Asian Americans succeed. What tools do you think they have to accomplish one or the other or both? Because they're very different than if you're a very senior person. If you're a senior person, you have a lot of other tools because you have a lot more power and a lot more leeway to do things within your organization. Eric, any thoughts?
Yeah. So, you know, we here at Gap, and we sort of had similar things in prior jobs I've been at. You know, there's going to be hopefully API ERGs that exist, right, for you to sort of connect. I think it's a good opportunity for people in the mid ranks to really take advantage of those linkages that are created to get visibility and access. What I find, and again, I don't have any sort of empirical data on this, but I saw it in some of the survey results, Peter, that you sort of alluded to, is that there's a general belief that Asians don't help Asians. And I'm saddened by it, but I also understand why people sort of believe it to be the case. That, you know, once an Asian has sort of gotten to a sort of a position of strength, they sort of forget about everybody else sort of underneath and who helped them along the way. Or vice versa, you know, if you're sort of in the middle, you feel embarrassed about asking someone else for help in the same way that potentially a Latino, a Latina do, or African American do, and so forth. And that support network isn't as strong. I actually think that while it definitely exists, has gotten a lot more better, better over time. And I do believe that Asians do want more to support other Asians, but there's still that quiet, reserved way of sort of doing so. And I think sort of taking advantage of being just a little bit more aggressive, not super aggressive, but aggressive of like, hey, seeking out people that are at senior ranks that can sort of help advocate and really utilizing that relationship in a positive way is one. I think the other thing that you know, what I would say that back to this notion of communication. What I find a lot on, besides sort of speaking and public, settings, is also sort of the form of networking, where I think there's a perception that Asians don't network well unless you're sort of with other Asians. And again, maybe that may be true, but I do feel like there are so many opportunities that do exist informally or formally at any company where there are networking opportunities where you can get access and visibility to other senior people within the company, whether they be white, Latino, Asian, whatever, and getting more and more visibility is an important thing. And I again, it of course has to be done with some level of decorum and delicate touch. But you know, I think knowing that somebody has ambition, knowing somebody that is willing to sort of put themselves out there, knowing someone who's willing to go up to somebody and say, "Hi, my name is so and so. I work in this group, 4 or 5 layers underneath you, but I really want to go and meet you and talk to you." Those are the little things that, as time goes on, when people start to evaluate talent within the organization, even though that wasn't a specific tool that was available to them, networking opportunities, these could be informal happy hours or whatever they might be, but just being present, showing up, being a little bit more aggressive. Those are like the little things that could make the difference of whether or not you're potentially promoted, whether you're seen as potentially a high potential, because of some of that notion of utilizing your presence, utilizing your language, being a little bit more outgoing, and also feeling like somebody that this could be someone that can network well, which ultimately, we work in a world where it's people to people relationships. And If you can't communicate one-on-one and you don't feel like that person is strong in doing so, that becomes a very, very huge barrier to success. So a mixture of that plus sort of relying that the actual Asian network is stronger than people could perceive it to be. I think those are two things that I would sort of comment there.
Yeah, I also add that not only should you think about mentorship going up or down, vertical, but your colleagues.
Yeah.
Think of your colleagues as a form of mentorship, because if they can give you advice and say, hey, look, I noticed the following, and I've got to stop doing that because it's hurting you, whatever. And if you're at the same level, then it's a different dynamic. And a lot of times, someone who's one of your peers is more willing to give you some good advice than someone either below you or above you. Joyce, anything on this issue about if you're
Yeah, I would
not
just
at
say,
the top, what tools you might have, right?
well, I do think one thing that's been very important at JP Morgan is working with other employee resource groups.
Mhm.
And so I have found that, like the Women's Network, there's a lot of commonality on what you would do for the Asian network. And during the pandemic, that was sort of a moment where we didn't let a crisis go to waste, because there are 9 different employee resource groups at JP Morgan, but we were the last group to get organized and to actually get an office for API affairs. So the pandemic provided that opportunity. It brought everybody together, because Stop API Hate was something that brought people together. It made us have to figure out different ways to organize because we had to do it virtually. And that's the point where we also asked for an office, but we also did things, because this is during George Floyd, with some of the other employee resource groups. So one thing I would just emphasize is just some of those commonalities, because I think you're right. It takes the Asians longer to organize. They're more reticent about doing it. So finding these points where we were able to partner with other groups and raising awareness on this, or for many people I talked to, they said they didn't really feel anything like this until the pandemic, where it was just so overt. Um, and I know that one of my frustrations has often been when I've organized these things. Sometimes I will have, senior Asian leaders say, well, this has happened to other people, but not to me. Really? I mean, but they don't necessarily, as Eric said, want to put it out there. It's just kind of culturally not something even if they want to help, they don't want to necessarily own the personal narrative. So I thought the pandemic was very important for making many people feel that personal ownership was something that they felt it was important, and it was worth articulating and coming together and getting more involved in these issues. And to me, that was a real turning point for the way a lot of the Asian programs were organized at JP Morgan. So I've always done the career development ones, but a lot of it was more cultural. And then it sort of switched to more sort of career development, working on leadership skills, and and also finding out ways to partner with other organizations where you have common objectives in mind.
Do you think, and this is a question to either one of you, do you think that this Asia hate, trend that happened, and also related to that, the tension between China and the US, do you think that's had any impact, and if so, in what way, on this issue of how people in the US, Asian Americans succeed within companies?
I mean, look, I think a lot of the anti-China sentiment is something politically where there is bipartisan support on that. I felt that during the pandemic, you could feel that more than, say, today, but it definitely can. I don't know if I would equate it to how you do in business as much as I would, a perception. Are Asians more of a threat?
Right,
It
right.
is it is the success of some Asians because they're good students more of a threat. Um, you know, uh, those kinds of things I think come up, which is I think a different question than whether you succeed in business or not. But certainly when you look at anti-China sentiment, and I found, because I work in so many different countries, that people don't know quite what to make of you when they meet you. Like I was born in Peoria, Illinois. I grew up in rural Iowa. But there still is like, well, are you Chinese? Are you like, they don't understand what Asian American is. So that is something that sometimes if you're in an international field, people don't quite understand that. So I wouldn't say that it's necessarily something that I would view as a business barrier, but it is definitely a cultural factor to, you know, to take into account.
Yeah, yeah. Eric, how do you feel?
Yeah, look, I was surprised to see the survey say that people didn't really feel like the U.S. China sort of.
Oh, yeah, that was one of the questions, right?
Well, that was one of the questions I saw. Yeah. So, but the people didn't feel like it was really impacting the career. I will say though that like on a general everyday basis, I don't really feel like the U.S. China relations
Yeah.
has really affected my career. Part of it is because even though my last name is Chan, and you would think that people would understand that I'm Chinese, there are still a lot of people who think, oh, are you Korean? Are you whatever? And so they don't sort of equate that sort of one to one as quickly. And they also don't necessarily see me as like a potential threat in any sort of way from like I'm not a spy or something like that, right? So I guess I don't necessarily see that on an every single day basis. But what I will say is I do sort of agree sort of with Joyce's broader comment, which I feel like Asians at times are getting sort of lumped into one bigger singular group of what they are, what they can't do, what they can't do, and so forth. And I think even today, there's a lot of people who come out of great schools and sort of you see their names and you're like, all right, well that's, and again, I've heard people talk about it like, well, that's just another smart Asian guy or gal that probably is great at mathematics and is great at science or something like that. They get lumped into these categories, or they're a great engineer, but if they sort of get lumped into certain things, I think that probably is a bigger sort of threat to me, is sort of the perception from a average person that Asians are much more one-dimensional in nature.
Yeah.
That to me is a much bigger threat than maybe even Asian hate or U.S. China.
I want to make one comment that relates to something you said earlier, Eric. You said how, some people think Asian Americans don't really help each other and that sort of thing.
Oh yeah.
The interesting thing is we had, about 2 years ago, we had two prominent researchers, Mike Morris from Columbia and a fellow from MIT. They did a study studying not only Asian Americans, but within the different Asian Americans, so South Asia and so forth. And the data was very interesting. It basically said one Asian American group did extremely well, in fact, better than Caucasian, and that was Indian Americans.
Mhm.
Right? And it isn't because they look Caucasian, because they don't. It isn't because they don't have an accent, because they, as many Indian Americans have an accent as Chinese or Japanese, so forth. But they said they're behavioral things that as a culture, they band together more, like Jewish Americans and so forth. And so I encourage those people in the audience who are interested in this question, go back, and all these are recorded, by the way, and listen to the ones where the researchers gave the results of their studies and why they thought it was the case. And the reason why is there's kind of a good lesson out of it. It says, are there things that Asian Americans who are not Indian American should do? Because take a look at it. I mean, so many of the top technology, Microsoft, so forth, they're Indian Americans, and it's not an accent. So sometimes you want to learn from other groups, but it's not just being Asian alone that is detrimental. I have a question for the two of you. 4 years ago, we did a summit on DEI, and we got leaders in DEI together. We got a big conference. We shared what were the best practices, what they did in each of their organizations, et cetera. Today, if we tried to have that, it would be very hard to have that conference, right? Because there's been such a movement against DEI. And any comment about that, and just saying, how do you deal with that? I mean, it's a fact that there's been suppression of DEI and so forth, and DEI has become kind of a negative phrase. Any comments about that in relation to this topic, which is how do you create positive organizational change?
this is a very timely topic. I'm actually giving a talk to the organization on inclusion and belonging, because that's sort of the new sort of DEI framing is you can't use diversity, but you can call it inclusion and belonging. And I was seeing some of the stats that she was, the person who runs inclusion and belonging here at Gap was showing me. And basically, one of the stats was that the average tenure of somebody of call it an ethnic background was staying at Gap 4 times less than a Caucasian. I sort of was like, okay, well, that's a very disheartening stat, but I want to go and have a conversation with the entire company, since I have the floor, about this conversation. And the answer was like, well, let's hold on having that conversation. Let's talk about it more broadly and so forth. But like, this is a real issue. Like, I want to understand systematically or systemically, like what's sort of happening that we're losing talent. I think we all can argue that and agree, I hope, that diverse thoughts lead to a better company at large. And yet we're losing some of that diversity in the people for whatever number of reasons, and I can't yet have that conversation. And so I guess it only makes this conversation harder when you can't sort of have these really blunt conversations within the organization. You got to navigate it accordingly, but it also just puts even more pressure on why conversations like this are very, very important, and why when you get to a position of power and influence, you really do, I wouldn't call it owe it, but it's really a responsibility that I feel to make sure that I leave a lasting legacy and or platform for other Asians to really take advantage of, because there's a lot of barriers, there's a lot of organization things, there's a lot of things, mentorship programs that have broken down, and then now there's this whole notion of it that you can't really talk about diversity, that you add to it that makes it hard. And so at that point, it becomes incumbent on people like me and people like Joyce to really step up and make sure that these things don't go unnoticed and don't go unspoken about, and continue to push where possible.
Yeah, Joyce, so has DEI become a four-letter word?
Well, we've actually changed it to DOI, so it's diversity, opportunity, and inclusion, because look, the G-SIB banks all got letters basically saying that that you could be penalized for having the program. So it wasn't that even, oh, your company doesn't want to do this. I mean, it was actually something where large systemically important banks and companies were receiving letters on whether they could have programs or not, or would be penalized for it. So then you do have to, because that wasn't just, oh, it's just this day and age. I mean, there were actually legal things that happened where companies had to change it, and they had to change the way that they approached it, that you have to let everybody in. It's not just for women, not just for Asians. It has, and this goes back to the working with other employee resource groups so that you can talk about things that are common. It comes back to, well, if before we were saying like what gets measured gets done, a lot of companies have stopped tracking it because they think they need to comply with the executive order they received. So it isn't just something that, oh, companies are making decisions to opt out. I mean, there are actual ramifications for why companies were put in this position as well. So this is one reason why I think it makes it more important than ever that you do work with other groups, right? Because there are common agendas. I also tell people, look, things go through cycles. I mean, today is not necessarily steady state. I mean, a year ago, it actually felt more precarious than it does a year later, and it will be different also when we were to have this dialogue a year or two from now as well. So keep the foundational things, but in place. But I think, as Eric says, it's very important to have the senior leadership that's there. And for many of the senior leaders who end up doing this, whether it's an Asian organization or Latino, or a women's organization, their own personal experience and history and just the longevity that they have been in certain industries, they're willing to stand up for it. But it's made that advocacy even more important. I think, at the individual level.
Well, I owe an apology to the audience because for some reason the Q&A chat box is not working, which is why we're not seeing any questions. I don't know why it was activated, but welcome to the technology world. What I would suggest is if you had a question that you wanted to pose either to Joyce or Eric, just send it through the Eventbrite where you registered, and it'll come to me and I'll get it to them, and we'll try to find a way to respond it. But I think this has been a wonderful session where, we pride ourselves on starting on time and ending on time, and it's now 7 o'clock. And I think there are a bunch of takeaways from this, and I hope that those of you in the audience really found this useful. Certainly for me, I would say, number one, it is clear that there are tools available to you, either if you at whatever level you are, in order to create organizational change that will help you succeed, but also help your colleagues succeed or Asian American. I think the other though is what I take away is it's not just organizational design, etc. You have to look at yourself, do a good self-assessment and say, who am I? What am I good at? What I'm not, and make sure you don't mismatch yourself with the wrong industry or wrong kind of company, and do a good job of assessing each company, whether, and not by industry necessarily, but by their structure, by their type, their size, and do a proper assessment, because those things will help you succeed, because you want to make sure you're playing the right game, not just how you play the game. You want to know what game you're actually in. But I really, really want to thank Eric and Joyce. This has been a wonderful conversation. The two of you are seasoned veterans and have seen a lot. And the idea though, Joyce, of you as a 20-something old, Asian woman running around talking to senior government people and trying to explain why they should talk to you. That's a mental image I'm going to keep for a long time. So thank you all. And oh, by the way, the best measure of whether or not the panelists have done a good job is if the number of people who were logged in at the beginning are equal to the line. And I will tell you, it's exactly the same. So that means the people who logged on were captivated by what you say. So I want to thank the two of you very much.
Well, thank you, Peter, for convening, and Eric, such a pleasure to be with you. And I really look forward to staying connected. And thank you to
Absolutely.
everybody for joining.
Thank you.